In 1966, a television show almost got canceled before its second episode even aired. The network thought it was too strange, too different, too risky. But what the executives didn't know was that this one show would change entertainment forever, and birth a phenomenon that's still growing 60 years later. Inside this script, we're revealing 20 facts about Star Trek that even the most dedicated fans have never heard. Some will shock you. Some will explain why the show almost died. And some will show you that the real story behind Star Trek is just as dramatic as anything that happened on screen. NBC looked at Star Trek and saw a disaster waiting to happen. The ratings were terrible. The concept seemed absurd to network executives in 1966. A spaceship? Aliens? Strange technology that didn't exist? They wanted to cancel it after just one season. But there was a problem. One man refused to let that happen. Gene Roddenberry, the show's creator, didn't accept defeat. He did something unprecedented in television history. He organized Star Trek fans to write letters to NBC, thousands of them. This wasn't a casual fan campaign. It was organized, was massive, and it worked in a way that changed how television networks listened to audiences forever. The letters started arriving by the hundreds, then by the thousands. NBC executives were shocked. They'd never seen anything like it. Fans weren't just casually interested. They were passionate. They felt personally connected to these characters in this world. The network realized something they hadn't understood before. Star Trek had created something deeper than entertainment. It had created a community. But here's the strange part. Even after saving the show once, Roddenberry had to fight again and again. The network kept threatening cancellation. The show was expensive to produce. Special effects cost money. Building sets cost money. Every episode felt like a battle just to stay on air. What nobody knew at the time was that this struggle, this fight for survival, would become the template for how devoted fan bases could actually influence media decisions. Think about how streaming services listen to fans today. Think about how shows get revived years after cancellation. Star Trek invented that. Roddenberry invented that. By the time the third season arrived, Star Trek was still hanging by a thread. The ratings were still low by 1960 standards. But the fan letters kept coming. They never stopped. And that loyalty would prove to be worth more than any rating number ever could. Nichelle Nichols played Lieutenant Uhura, the communications officer on the USS Enterprise. She was brilliant in the role. She brought intelligence, strength, and dignity to every scene. But there's a fact about her casting that NBC executives didn't want America to know. They almost didn't let her be on the show at all. In 1966, American television had a serious problem. It was segregated. Black actors rarely appeared on TV. And when they did, they were usually in minor roles or stereotypical characters. NBC executives were terrified that putting a black woman in a prominent role on Star Trek would upset Southern audiences and advertisers. They worried about losing sponsors. They worried about boycotts. So they made a decision that they thought would protect their investment. They told Nichelle Nichols that her character would be leaving the show. Nichols was devastated. She was ready to quit acting entirely. But then something unexpected happened. She ran into Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. at a benefit event. They talked about Star Trek. And King told her something that changed her perspective completely. He said that her role on the show was important. Not just for entertainment, but for what it represented. For what it meant to see a black woman in a position of authority on television. King convinced her to stay. To keep fighting. To keep showing up on that set every single day. What makes this even more remarkable is what happened next. Young black girls started writing letters to the show. They wrote about seeing themselves represented on screen. They wrote about imagining futures where they could be anything they wanted, including space officers. Nichelle Nichols became a symbol. She broke a barrier that television executives had been afraid to cross. Years later, Nichols would become a recruiter for NASA. She personally recruited many of the first African American and female astronauts. The show that executives wanted to cancel had created a ripple effect that reached into the real world. A character that was almost erased from television history had instead inspired real people to reach for the stars. Harlan Ellison wrote one of the most famous Star Trek episodes of all time. It's called The City on the Edge of Forever. Fans still rank it as one of the greatest science fiction stories ever told on television. But getting that script made was a nightmare. Ellison submitted his story idea to Star Trek producers over 40 times. 40 times. He was rejected. Changed. Revised. Asked to rewrite. Asked to add more action. Asked to remove dialogue. Asked to explain things differently. Most writers would have given up after the fifth rejection. After the 10th, they'd have moved on to other projects. But Ellison kept coming back. He kept believing in his story. The episode is about time travel. It's about sacrifice. It's about a captain who has to choose between saving the woman he loves and saving the entire timeline of history. The emotional weight of that choice is devastating. It's not a simple action story. It's a meditation on impossible decisions, on consequences, on what we're willing to lose for the greater good. Network executives didn't understand it at first. They thought it was too slow, too philosophical, too sad. Science fiction, in their minds, was supposed to be about explosions and aliens attacking spaceships. Not about characters standing in the rain, making heartbreaking choices. But Ellison refused to compromise the core of his story. He fought for every scene, every line of dialogue. When the episode finally aired, something unexpected happened. It became a phenomenon. Fans wrote in saying it was the most powerful episode they'd ever seen. Critics praised it. Other writers in Hollywood started studying it to understand how to structure emotional science fiction storytelling. The irony is brutal. The script that was rejected 40 times went on to win a Hugo Award, one of the highest honors in science fiction. Years later, Ellison would win an Oscar for his screenplay work. The same story that network executives didn't believe in became proof that audiences wanted depth. They wanted meaning. They wanted stories that made them feel something. Harlan Ellison's refusal to give up didn't just save one episode. It changed what television producers believed was possible in science fiction storytelling. It proved that you didn't need explosions and action to create compelling drama. You needed truth. Spock is one of the most iconic characters in television history. His pointed ears. His logical thinking. His calm demeanor in chaos. But there's a detail about his appearance that almost never made it to screen. His skin color. Gene Roddenberry's original vision for Spock included green skin. Not the pale human skin that Leonard Nimoy ended up with. The producers thought it would make the character look more alien. More visibly different from humans. More scientifically advanced in appearance. But when they started casting, they ran into a massive problem. In 1966, makeup technology was primitive compared to what we have today. Green makeup for an entire television series would have been extraordinarily expensive. It would have taken hours to apply before every single scene. It would have required special care between takes. The budget simply didn't allow for it. NBC was already nervous about the show's costs. Adding expensive makeup work every single day seemed impossible. But there's another reason they abandoned the green skin idea. A reason that's more interesting than budget concerns. Test audiences didn't respond well to it. When they showed potential viewers footage of an alien character with green skin, something unexpected happened. People found it harder to connect emotionally with the character. The green skin created too much distance. Made Spock feel too alien. Too other. What producers realized was that the pointed ears alone were enough. The ears created visual distinction without creating emotional separation. Audiences could see that Spock was different, but they could still see his face. They could still read his expressions. They could still connect with him as a character, not just an alien concept. Leonard Nimoy's performance became legendary precisely because of this decision. His face became the canvas for Spock's emotions, or the absence of them. His eyebrow raise became one of the most recognizable expressions in television history. His controlled delivery of logical statements created tension through what he wasn't showing, not through alien makeup effects. The irony is that by deciding not to make Spock visibly alien, they made him more alien in every other way. More logical. More restrained. More fundamentally different in how he thought and processed the world. The character became iconic not because of what they added to him, but because of what they stripped away. The USS Enterprise wasn't designed by a starship engineer. It was designed by a man who had never worked in television before. His name was Matt Jeffries and he was an aircraft designer. When Gene Roddenberry brought him on to create the look of Star Trek Starship, Jeffries had no idea he was about to design one of the most recognizable objects in entertainment history. Jeffries approached the Enterprise like he would approach an airplane. He thought about aerodynamics. He thought about function. He thought about how a vessel would actually move through space if the physics were real. Most science fiction ships in 1966 looked like flying saucers or needle-nosed rockets. They looked like toys. They looked like what people imagined aliens might build without understanding actual engineering. Jeffries designed something different. Something that looked functional. The saucer section made sense as a command center. The engine nacelles looked like they could actually propel the ship. The proportions seemed balanced. The design suggested that this wasn't just a fantasy object. It was something that could theoretically exist. What's remarkable is that Jeffrey's design was so thoughtfully constructed that it influenced spacecraft design in the real world. NASA engineers and actual rocket scientists have said that Star Trek's Enterprise looked more scientifically plausible than many other science fiction ships. It didn't look like fantasy. It looked like a logical solution to a real problem. But here's the strange part. Jeffries almost walked away from the project before it started. He was skeptical about the whole thing. Science fiction television seemed ridiculous to him. Why would audiences care about stories set in space? Why would they connect with characters on an alien starship? He almost turned down the job entirely. What changed his mind was meeting with Roddenberry. Roddenberry explained his vision. He talked about what the show could mean. He talked about exploration, about humanity's future, about asking the big questions. Jeffries realized he was being asked to design more than a spaceship. He was being asked to design a symbol. The Enterprise became that symbol. It became the physical representation of humanity's curiosity, of our willingness to explore, of our hope that the future could be better than the past. Jeffries' aircraft design background gave the ship credibility, but Roddenberry's vision gave it meaning. Together, they created something that would endure for over 60 years. In 1966, nobody owned a computer at home. The internet didn't exist. Personal tablets were pure science fiction. But Star Trek's writers and designers were imagining them anyway. They created devices on the show that look almost identical to modern iPads and tablets. This wasn't a lucky guess. It was logical thinking about where technology was headed. The show featured handheld devices that crew members used to access information. These devices had screens. They displayed data. They could be held in one hand. They were portable. They were intuitive. In 1966, this was pure imagination. No such technology existed anywhere on Earth. But the writers understood something fundamental about human needs. People would eventually want portable access to information. They would want screens they could hold. They would want technology that was simple and elegant. What makes this prediction even more remarkable is that it influenced real technology development. Engineers and designers working in Silicon Valley in the 1990s and 2000s grew up watching Star Trek. They saw these imaginary devices and thought, why shouldn't we build something like that? Why shouldn't we make this real? The parallels are striking. Look at a Star Trek PADD, the portable access display device. Now look at an iPad. The similarities aren't coincidental. They're conceptual. Star Trek showed designers what was possible, what was desirable, what users would actually want to interact with. But it goes deeper than just devices. Star Trek imagined voice-activated computers. Computers that could understand natural language. Computers that responded to questions asked in plain English, not computer code. In 1966, this seemed impossible. Voice recognition technology barely existed. But the show normalized the idea. It made audiences believe that talking to computers was natural. It was the future. Today we have Alexa. We have Siri. We have Google Assistant. Millions of people talk to their devices every single day. They expect their technology to understand them, to respond naturally, to anticipate their needs. Star Trek planted that seed 60 years ago. The most fascinating part is that the show's creators weren't trying to predict the future. They were just asking, what would make sense? What would be logical? What would humans actually want? And by asking those questions, they accidentally mapped out technology that wouldn't exist for decades. They showed us not just what was possible but what was inevitable. In 1969, Star Trek was dying. NBC had decided to cancel it. The network executives had made their final decision. The show would end after 3 seasons. There was nothing anyone could do about it, or so they thought. What happened next was unprecedented in television history. Fans didn't just accept the cancellation passively. They organized. They mobilized. They created one of the first massive fan campaigns in entertainment history. And they did it without the internet, without social media, without any of the tools we use today to organize movements. Fans created a petition. They gathered signatures. Thousands of signatures. They mailed letters to NBC. They called the network. They showed up at offices. They made their voices heard in every way they possibly could. But what made this different from other fan campaigns was the scale and the sophistication of the organization. Gene Roddenberry gave fans the tools they needed. He provided addresses where letters could be sent. He helped coordinate the effort. He believed that if enough people spoke up, the network would have to listen. He was betting everything on the idea that audiences had real power, that their voices actually mattered. The campaign worked. NBC reversed its decision. Star Trek was saved. Not because of ratings. Not because of advertising revenue. But because fans proved that they cared enough to fight for what they loved. This was a revolutionary moment in television history. It proved that networks couldn't just dismiss audiences. It proved that passionate communities could actually influence decisions made by powerful corporations. But here's what makes this even more significant. It created a template. Years later, when shows faced cancellation, fans would remember this moment. They would remember that petitions worked. That organized campaigns could change outcomes. Today, every time a show gets revived due to fan pressure, Star Trek's petition is the precedent. The cancellation that seemed final became a turning point instead. It taught the television industry that audiences weren't passive consumers. They were active participants. They had stakes in these stories. They deserved to be heard. Star Trek didn't just survive because of fan power. The entire relationship between television networks and audiences changed because of what happened in 1969. Before The Man Trap became the first Star Trek episode to air on television, there was another pilot. It was called The Cage. Gene Roddenberry directed it himself. He poured everything he had into that episode. It was his vision made real. But when NBC executives watched it, they hated it. The Cage featured Captain Pike, not Captain Kirk. It had a completely different tone than what would eventually define the series. It was slower, more philosophical, more cerebral. The action sequences felt sparse. The focus was on dialogue and character and ideas. NBC executives looked at it and said, "This isn't what audiences want. This is too weird. Too slow. Too cerebral." They rejected the entire pilot. They told Roddenberry to start over. They demanded a new captain. They wanted more action. More conflict. More traditional television storytelling. Most creators would have been devastated. Most would have given up right there. The network had essentially said, "Your vision is wrong." But Roddenberry didn't accept that verdict. He fought back. He convinced NBC to let him make a second pilot. This time he brought in William Shatner as Captain Kirk. This time he added more action. More dramatic confrontation. More traditional television elements. The second pilot, Where No One Has Gone Before, was different. It was faster. It was louder. It was more palatable to network executives. NBC approved it. Star Trek was greenlit for a full series. But here's the incredible part. The Cage wasn't wasted. Roddenberry didn't throw it away. Years later, he incorporated it into the show itself. He edited it and expanded it into a two-part episode called The Menagerie. It became one of the most celebrated episodes of the entire series. What seemed like a rejection became a gift. The original pilot that NBC rejected is now considered essential Star Trek. Fans recognize it as capturing something pure about Roddenberry's original vision. Something that got watered down as the show evolved to survive network demands. The lesson is complicated. Star Trek had to compromise to survive. It had to give NBC what they wanted commercially. But those compromises didn't destroy Roddenberry's core vision. They shaped it. They challenged it. And ultimately they made the show stronger. Sometimes the thing that almost kills your dream is exactly what you need to make it real. Star Trek was made on a shoestring budget in the 1960s. There was no time for perfection. Episodes had to be shot quickly. Sets had to be reused. Special effects had to be improvised. And sometimes mistakes happened. Real mistakes. Technical failures. Accidents. But instead of reshooting scenes, producers just left them in the final episode. One of the most famous examples happens in the episode, A Private Little War. There's a scene where Captain Kirk is supposed to be hurt and struggling. The actor playing Kirk actually trips and falls during the take. It wasn't scripted. It wasn't planned. It was a genuine accident. But the director liked how it looked. It added realism. So they kept it in the episode. Kirk's stumble became part of the final broadcast. In another episode, a crew member's hand is visible moving a prop that's supposed to be floating in space. It's obviously a mistake. The hand shouldn't be there. But there it is in the final cut. Audiences noticed these things immediately. But instead of ruining the episodes, these moments became charming. They added authenticity. They reminded viewers that this was a real production made by real people, not a polished corporate product. The budget constraints meant that Star Trek couldn't hide its imperfections behind expensive special effects and reshoots. It had to work with what it had. And sometimes, what it had included mistakes that accidentally improved the final product. A stumbling actor became more human. A visible hand became a reminder of the craftspeople behind the scenes. What's remarkable is that this rawness became part of Star Trek's charm. Later science fiction shows with bigger budgets and more time often felt sterile by comparison. They were too perfect, too polished. Star Trek felt lived in because it was made by people working under pressure, making the best they could with limited resources. Some of these bloopers became legendary among fans. People would pause their recordings and point out the visible crew members, the matte paintings that didn't quite align, the props that wobbled. Instead of these being embarrassing moments, they became proof of dedication. These people cared enough to push forward despite limitations. They didn't have the luxury of endless retakes. They had one chance to get it right, and when they didn't, they kept moving. This constraint actually forced Star Trek to be better in the ways that mattered. The writing had to be strong because the production couldn't rely on flashy effects. The acting had to be compelling because the sets were minimal. The storytelling had to grip audiences because there were no distractions. Sometimes the things that limit you end up being your greatest strength. Star Trek ended in 1969. The final episode aired on June 3. NBC had canceled the show. The petition campaigns hadn't saved it this time. The network was done. They'd given the show 3 seasons, 3 chances to succeed. And by traditional television metrics, it had failed. The ratings weren't there. The sponsors weren't satisfied. It was time to move on to something new. But something strange happened after the show ended. Instead of disappearing, Star Trek started growing. Fans who hadn't watched during the original run discovered it in reruns. Colleges started organizing Star Trek viewing parties. Conventions began forming around the show. The audience wasn't shrinking. It was multiplying. The show that NBC thought was a failure was actually just beginning. This created a bizarre situation. Star Trek had the lowest ratings when it was on the air. But it had the highest cultural impact after it was canceled. The television industry didn't understand what was happening. How could a show with bad ratings become this influential? How could a canceled series generate more excitement than active shows on the network? The answer was that Star Trek had created something that transcended television ratings. It had created a universe that audiences wanted to live in. Characters they cared about deeply. Stories they wanted to continue. A future they believed in. The show didn't end because people stopped caring. It ended because the network ran out of patience. But the audience's appetite for Star Trek had barely begun. Gene Roddenberry understood this. He didn't accept that the show was truly over. He started working on movies. He gave speeches about the show's cultural significance. He kept the vision alive in the minds of fans. He refused to let Star Trek become a historical artifact. He treated it as an ongoing story that would eventually find new platforms. For over a decade, Star Trek existed only in reruns and fan imagination. Then in 1979, the first Star Trek movie was released. Suddenly, the show that networks thought was dead came back to life. Bigger than before. More expensive. More ambitious. And it proved that the audience had never disappeared. They'd just been waiting. Waiting for Star Trek to give them more. What followed was unprecedented in television history. Spin-off shows. Hundreds of movies and novels. A cultural phenomenon that just kept growing. 50 years later, Star Trek is still producing new content. Still expanding the universe. Still attracting new audiences. The show that was canceled in 1969 has become immortal. It never really ended. It just transformed into something larger than television could contain.